Imagine waking up in the morning to find out that your bedroom is now located in a different country, literally, where your living room and kitchen are still in the country you fell asleep. Overnight, the border has been unofficially redrawn by occupied forces from a hostile northern neighbor. Such nightmarish vulnerability has been real for thousands living close and near Russian-occupied lines in Georgia. Georgia is a tiny nation of under 4 million people, and it's at the crossroads of Europe, Asia, and the Middle East. Much of the outside world knows little of our country, and our very existence is threatened by aggression from neighboring Russia. In fact, 20% of Georgia is occupied by Russia. My long-term project, which I call The Shifting Borders, depicts the ongoing reality and conflict along the occupied lines of Georgia's two breakaway regions, South Ossetia and Abkhazia. South Ossetia, like Abkhazia, has been targeted by Russian aggression since the collapse of the Soviet Union. Today in South Ossetia, the Russian forces continue to push their administrative boundary to expand control and flaunt their power. Some 288,000 Georgians remain eternally displaced. As a Georgian photojournalist, I'm on a mission to defend against outsiders' attempt to erase our culture, our history, and national borders. My photographs tell the story of ordinary people's survival in the shadow of a superpower. So the Shifting Borders website project highlights local situations and individual stories that happen near the occupied lines of South Ossetia. Supported by the Catchlight Global Fellowship and realized by my dream team, Rudy Wegman and Joris Nordemir, the visual map contains a series of images, videos, and personal letters contributed by the residents that operates as an active virtual archive updated on a regular basis. So letters, because it holds a very deep and emotional connection to me personally. When I was young, I lived in the United States, which I will talk about later. But I used to receive letters from my grandparents, my friends, classmates, neighbors, and I could not wait to read them. They told me much of the life that I had living during that time in the 90s in Georgia. And the really fun part for me was their handwriting. I really enjoyed that because it told a different story, apart from the story that they were writing to me. So the website offers content in 3 languages, English, Georgian, and Russian. This multilingual approach extends outreach, and Georgian for Georgians, English for international readers, and Russian for Russian-speaking people who live in Georgia and are not aware of the situation. Russian occupation and the so-called administrative borders in South Ossetia encroach daily on Georgian territory. So the borders are very mutable, as you can see, and sometimes unmarked. You can get arrested, shot, or even killed because you're stepping in a place you're not supposed to be. But you have no idea because there's no sign. I have lived through witnessed firsthand some really heartbreaking stories, like story of Thomas Ginturi, who was shot dead near the Lomisi church in Kirbali village. So Kirbali village is one of the most dangerous areas near the occupied borderline. And the lack of physical territorial markers leads to confusion and tragedy as locals are targeted without warning because they unwittingly cross the unmarked administrative border. One journey, I documented a 14-year-old boy, his name is Dato, risking his life to visit his ailing grandmother on the Russian-occupied territory. So dodging patrols, he symbolizes for me our people's resilience. And I traveled this path with him, taking pictures all along on a journey that took us 4 hours to crawl, walk, hide, and cross the irrigation canals. When we got close to the barbed wire fence, we hid for an hour in an abandoned house nearby, observing the comings and goings of Russian-backed militants in a hut nearby. And ultimately, when the coast was clear, I said goodbye to Dato, and realizing that the solo homeward journey I had to take demanded extreme care. I could not make any mistakes, or I could be detained by Russian-backed militants. Or Georgian border police, neither sounded great to me. But I did not make mistakes that much. I did took one wrong path and ended up in someone's yard, but I got home safe. So this journey I took with Dato because I read his letter, and I asked him to write me anything he wanted to tell me. So he wrote me a letter. Listen to his letter.
ამ წერილის მიზანია დაგანახოთ მომავალ თაობას რუსული ოკუპაცია. თუ როგორ დაგვაშორეს ოჯახის წევრებს, ჩვენ საყვარელ ადამიანებს. მე დამაშორეს პაპას და ბაბოს. ოკუპაციისთან ბრძოლაში გარდაიცვალა პაპაჩემ.
The reason for this letter is for you to understand what Russian occupation means, how it separated families and the people we love the most. It separated me and my grandparents. My grandfather died fighting the Russian occupation. But fortunately, my grandma is alive, and I believe someday the barbed wire fence will be demolished. I have one grandma left, and she's very ill. So sometimes during the school holidays, I sneak into the Russian-occupied territory when Russian guards are not inside the hut nearby. I'm scared to death. One day, the doctors called me and told me that my grandma is very sick. So I again had to put my fear aside and started my journey by foot from home, in a village nearby. The road is 8 kilometers. It takes 3-4 hours to get close to the barbed wire fence, to Khurvadat village. I had to hide from the Georgian border police as well. If they see me, they will not allow me to continue my journey because it is too dangerous. I had to walk quietly, sometimes crawling, hiding under the corn bushes. I was very scared, but love kills fear. I jumped over the barbed wire fence when Russian-backed forces were not nearby, ran to my grandma's house, which is located very close, and when I went inside the house, I saw my grandmother on the floor. She fell, for God knows how long, and could not get up or reach her bed. I grabbed her right away and pulled her up the bed. She was frozen. It was winter. She could not understand who I was, but once she felt safer, she recognized me and felt joy. We hugged each other. Like Dato, I was also 14 years old when I started taking pictures, and becoming a photographer was not a deliberate choice for me. It had many stages in my life before I came to realize what photography meant to me and what I was doing. I'm part of the 90s generation, so I grew up after the collapse of Soviet Union. We lacked electricity, water, and heat, so my family decided to migrate to America. But after a couple of years, despite the terrible and unpredictable future that lay ahead of us, we returned to Georgia at the end of the 90s. The reason for this, my dad asked me one day when we lived in the States to read in Georgian, and it took me really long to understand one single sentence. And I could not figure out what the letters meant. And that year, we returned to Georgia. So my parents did not want me to forget my identity and language. So they made this difficult decision to go back to Georgia. They also grew up during the Soviet regime, and my father always told me stories of my great-grandfather. He was a cinematographer, and he served 12 years exiled in Siberia prison. He was sentenced to death penalty because he was part of an anti-Soviet organization called Samani. So that was a part of growing up during the Soviet occupation. For me, it was really tough coming back to Georgia because I was thinking in English and unable to express myself in Georgian. And it was around that time that I got hold of the camera. So from that day forward, it became the way of speaking to the world around me. And later in life, I realized that photos can change consciousness in people and let them think differently about certain topics. So from that moment, I concentrated on stories in Georgia that touched on taboo topics like early marriages, the conditions faced by mine workers, stories about minorities, Chechen refugees, and how post-Soviet healthcare system, sorry, I was not pressing this, how the post-Soviet health created a pandemic of stolen babies. It's an investigative story that I'm working on now. And how the conflict with Russia led to surreal border dynamics, which I described earlier. And a story I ask you to explore and see after my talk by visiting the shiftingborders.com. So after 16 years of documenting these struggles, in 2024, as we face an increasingly interconnected world, it's crucial to recognize that the issue of border shifts and occupation is not confined by one region, but it's a global concern, and it demands a collective action and empathy from all of us. Shifting borders uproot people. Some stay, others flee, trapped in their own country or as refugees. They lose basic freedom and rights. Each photograph I show tells a story of people's survival and hope, and these images serve as a reminder of our strength and resilience as a nation. We will not be erased. Thank you.